By the spring of 1945, every bridge across the Rhine had fallen. One still stood, wired to drop at the turn of a key. American armor was already on the hills above the river, and down at the water, a German hand closed over the demolition switch.
For most of that grey afternoon, the German engineer in charge of the bridge at Remagen was certain of one thing. When the moment came, he would turn a key and the bridge would fall into the river. He had every reason to be certain. The charges were already in place, wired the length of the great railway spans, waiting on a single electrical circuit that ran back to the switch where he stood. It was the 7th of March 1945. Behind him lay the last wide river in front of the homeland, and every other bridge across it had already been dropped, on time, exactly as ordered. This one was still up only because his own side was still using it, pulling men and guns back across to the eastern bank. When the last of them was over, he would send it down into the water. That was the plan, and the plan was sound. It had been done a dozen times that winter, all the way back across 2 countries. A river, a bridge, a switch, and then no bridge. Then, a little after midday, an American armored column came down out of the wooded hills on the western side and saw the one thing that was not supposed to be there: a bridge over the last river. Still standing, still whole. They belonged to the 9th Armored Division, a spearhead that had been driving east faster than anyone above them had planned for. No order had sent them to take a bridge. There was not supposed to be one left to take. What those men did in the few hours that followed would be told and retold for a long time. But the clearest judgment ever passed on it was not written by them. It was written by the German command, in the days right after, in a form that left no argument at all about how much that one afternoon had cost them. The bridge had a name. It was called the Ludendorff Bridge, a heavy railway crossing of black iron and pale stone, with 2 dark stone towers standing guard where it met each bank. It had carried troop trains toward the front in one war, and it was built, from the beginning, to be destroyed on command in the next. Its own makers had left it wired for its death. This is the story of one bridge, one afternoon, and one crossing that was written into no plan on either side, and of the men on the German bank who would answer, with their lives, for letting it happen. Because the judge in this story is German. That is the thing that makes his verdict worth hearing. The German certainty was not arrogance, it was procedure. Dropping a bridge in the enemy's face was one of the things their engineers did best, and they had done it, cleanly, all the way home. The charges at Remagen were set. The firing circuit was laid down the spans. An officer stood at the switch with his hand near it. On paper, the bridge was already gone. It simply had not been told yet. And the river at its feet was the real defense. Wide, cold, and quick. The kind of barrier armies plan around for months, that turns a running advance back into a slow crawl paid for in men. The engineer who held the switch knew his craft. He had watched other bridges answer him all winter, dropping into the water at the turn of a key, on the second, the way they were meant to. More than once that winter he had stood at a switch like this one and felt the ground jump as a span folded into the river behind him. The current took the wreckage, and the enemy was left on the wrong bank, looking across at open water. It had never once failed. So the bridge was wired, and the man was ready, and the river was deep. Everything that was supposed to be true was true, and still the wiring was not quite what it looked like. The proper military explosive, the reliable kind, had not come forward in the amount that had been asked for. In its place, the men had packed a weaker industrial charge, the sort meant for breaking rock in a quarry, and an order from higher up had cut the amount down further still, out of a fear that a blast too large might be wasted or might tear loose too soon. The bridge was mined to fall. It was not mined enough to be sure of it. Nobody at the switch knew that yet. The weakness was hidden inside the very thing they trusted most. The charges looked like certainty. They were not. Everywhere else along that river, crossing it meant the hard way. Assault boats in the dark. Men in a cold current with the far bank firing down on them. Engineers laying a road across open water while it fought back. It meant days of that, and long lists of the lost, and a set-piece attack planned down to the last boat and the last minute. That was the price the last river was built to charge. Somewhere down that same river, other men were already rehearsing the hard way, the boats and the ropes and the night crossing, counting on buying the far bank the way it had always been bought. None of them yet knew a bridge was about to make the lesson pointless. A bridge, left standing, charged none of it. On a standing bridge, a man could simply walk to the other side of the barrier and keep his feet dry doing it. Both banks understood that difference in an instant. The Americans who reached it were not the ones chosen to make the crossing. The great planned assault was meant to come later, and further down the river, with all of its boats and its massed guns. These were a forward task force that had run ahead of its own maps. When the bridge came into view in the valley below them, still up, the officer in front had minutes, not hours, to decide whether to reach for it. There was a hard argument against it. A bridge left whole might be a trap, packed and waiting, set to drop the instant men were out in the middle of it, over the water, with nowhere to go. Everything they had learned all the way across Europe said the thing should already be gone. Bridges did not survive an army's retreat. This one had, and that alone should have warned them off. The choice did not stay with the officer on the road. It went up, fast, to the general driving the advance, a man who could see in one look what a whole bridge was worth, and what a trap might cost if it was one. He weighed it in minutes, and sent one word back down the line: take it. He sent them onto it anyway. All of it happened in the space of a single afternoon, on and under a few hundred yards of iron and rotting plank, over a cold river running high with the March melt. A haze hung over the water when it began, and then it lifted, and the bridge stood out clear and long and terribly open, with those two stone towers at the far end looking straight back down its length. The infantry went first. A company of armored infantry, on foot, up out of cover and out onto the span, with every window and slit in the far towers staring down the line of them. The first shots came from the towers almost at once, flat and hard across the open iron, striking sparks off the rails and the girders. The company did not stop. Stopping out on the bridge was the one thing worse than crossing it. Their officer was a young lieutenant named Karl Timmerman, who had been handed the company only days before. The order to walk men out onto a bridge that might vanish beneath them came to rest on him. He went out onto it first, and because he did, the men came out after him, from behind cover, into the open, over the water, boots loud on the torn planking. The planking was loose and gapped, torn open in places, straight down to the grey water sliding past below. A man could see the river between his own boots. There was no cover anywhere on the length of it, only distance, and a far end that came no closer fast enough. On the eastern bank, the German engineer saw them coming and reached for the certainty he had held all day. He gave the order to fire the charges. Nothing happened. The circuit was dead. Somewhere out along the span, the cable that carried the spark had been cut, torn through by a shell or by the men now moving across it. The switch turned under his hand, and the bridge did not move. There was one way left, and it was a terrible one. A man would have to go out onto the bridge himself, on foot, in the open, under the fire coming across the water, and light the emergency charge by hand. A sergeant named Anton Faust went. He ran out onto the span, into the same open the Americans were crossing, found the hand igniter, and set it off with his own two hands. Behind the igniter, the engineer watched two things happen at once, and could stop neither. One of his own men was out on the span fighting to bring it down. The enemy was out on that same span fighting to keep it up. Their work crossed somewhere in the smoke. This time the bridge answered him. A heavy charge let go beneath the deck. The whole span lifted, rose against the grey sky, seemed to hang there a moment, and then dropped back down onto itself. Smoke and dust rolled the length of it in a wall. For a few seconds, no man on either bank could see whether the bridge was still there, or whether the river had finally swallowed it. The men out on the deck felt it buck under their feet, felt the iron heave and settle, and waited, flat against whatever they could reach, for the fall that would take them into the water with it. When the smoke thinned, the bridge was still standing. wounded down its length, its deck torn open, planks and metal thrown wide. But standing. The undersized charge had not been enough to finish it. And out among the smoke, other Americans were already doing the one thing that would keep it standing. A small party of engineers had climbed out onto the span, in among the charges that had not yet blown. Their lieutenant was named Hugh Mott. With 2 sergeants working beside him, he moved along the bridge in the open, hunting down the demolition wires and cutting them through, by hand, one at a time. They cut the cables where they ran along the beams. They wrenched the heavy charges loose from the ironwork and let them fall away into the river below, one after another, while the far end still fought. It was slow, deliberate work, done bent double over a structure that might still go up beneath them at any second. They did not hurry it, and they did not leave it, until every wire they could find was dead. At the far end, the infantry were pushing through the last of the fight. The 2 stone towers had to be cleared, room by room, and a black railway tunnel behind them that ran straight back into the hillside. Men began to come out of the tunnel with their hands raised, blinking in the grey light, stepping over their own wire. The far bank was going quiet in the way that means ground is changing hands, not the way that means a pause. One sergeant broke out of the fighting on the span and simply ran. His name was Alexander Drabik, and he ran the last long stretch flat out, weaving, his helmet gone, until his boots came down on the eastern bank. He was the first soldier of that whole army to cross the last river and stand on the far side of it on his own 2 feet, on ground that was supposed to have been safe behind the water. Behind him, the rest came on across the ruined deck, and the eastern bank, yard by yard, tower by tower, stopped being German ground and started being a foothold. The lieutenant who had stepped out first came off the far end and stood on the eastern bank among his own men, on the ground the whole width of the river had been built to deny them. He had brought a company across a bridge that had tried to fall out from under it. None of it would have held without the guns at their backs. On the western bank, a heavy American tank had pulled down to the water's edge, its gun laid flat along the length of the bridge. It fired on the towers, on the firing slits, on anything that lifted a weapon toward the men out on the span. It kept the far end pinned down while the infantry crossed and the engineers cut the wires. By the close of the afternoon it was done. A company of armoured infantry stood on the eastern bank, the charges lay on the river bottom, and the last great river had a hole punched clean through the middle of it. The men who had done it were wet and tired, and not yet sure themselves what the afternoon had been. The word for it would not come from them. It would come from the other side of the water. When the news climbed the chain to the German High Command, it did not land as a setback to be patched. It landed as a disaster, a bridge over the last river, taken whole, in an afternoon, without the fight the planners had even imagined. The answer came in the shape of a court. A special tribunal was sent out with the authority to try, then and there, the officers who had held responsibility for the bridge at Remagen. It found them guilty of the one charge that mattered. They had failed to destroy the bridge in time, and the sentence it handed down was carried out against a wall, by a firing squad, within days. 4 officers were shot for that afternoon. A 5th, already a prisoner in American hands and beyond their reach, was condemned in his absence, his death sentence left waiting on a man they could no longer touch. The weight of that is worth pausing on. The sharpest measure of what those men on the bridge had done was not taken by the men who crossed it. It was taken by the enemy, who judged the loss of one railway bridge so far past forgiving that he put 4 of his own officers against a wall for allowing it to stand. That is the verdict. It is written in their hand, not anyone else's. Armies lose bridges. They lose them in every war, on every front, and they do not, as a rule, shoot the men who lost them. That this command did, over this one bridge, is the whole weight of the afternoon pressed down into a single terrible act. And there was a second verdict, set down not in a courtroom, but in everything the German side hurled at the bridge in the days that followed. They did not treat it as a small break to be sealed up at leisure. They set out to destroy the thing with everything they had left, and they did it without pause, day and night. Heavy guns walked their shells back and forth across the span. Aircraft came at it low, again and again, far more of them than a single bridge should ever have been worth. They sent some of their newest jet aircraft against it, a weapon too rare and too precious to spend on one crossing, and they spent it on this one anyway. They aimed long-range rockets at it, the same kind they were dropping on distant cities, brought down now onto a few hundred yards of iron on one river. And when all of that failed, they sent swimmers into the black water at night to try to reach it by hand. 2 records, one finding, the court that shot its own officers, and the storm of steel that chased the bridge for days on end, both say the very same thing about that afternoon. The honest record keeps the other side of it too, because the bridge did not stand for long, and it did not stand for free. It had been dying from the moment the failed charge tore into it, wounded underneath, worn thin by the weight of tanks and trucks pouring across, hammered from the air for days without rest. 10 days after it was taken, with men still working on it to hold it together, the bridge finally gave way on its own and went down into the river, and it carried a number of American engineers down with it. By then, it had already done the thing it was taken for. Men and machines had crossed it for 10 days and nights, and a second bridge and a third had gone in beside it. When it fell, the army it had carried was already across, and on the far bank in strength. And the crossing did not win the war on its own. The eastern bank was a narrow, dangerous ledge for a while, shelled and counterattacked, and it was other crossings, made later and in force, that truly broke the door open. The bridge was not magic. It was a wounded structure, held through 10 hard days, that handed the advance a running start it had never been meant to have. Both of those things are true, and the record keeps them both. But set the 2 ways side by side, and the meaning of the afternoon stands clear at last. The last river was built to charge its full price. Boats in the dark, a planned assault, days of men in the cold current under fire, a long casualty list bought for a few yards of the far shore. What happened at Remagen charged almost none of it. A company walked across a standing bridge in an afternoon, and the barrier the German command had counted on for its defense was, of a sudden, simply not there. That was the thing the enemy could not forgive. Not that the crossing had been costly, but that it had been cheap. The last wall had not been stormed. It had been stepped over. The bridge is gone now. It was never rebuilt. Only the 2 dark stone towers still stand on the banks, one on each side, facing each other across the empty gap where the crossing used to run. Inside one of them there is a quiet place kept in memory of the afternoon. People walk through it now who were not yet born when the span came down into the water. The men who crossed grew old, and most of them said very little about it. The young lieutenant who led the company out onto the open bridge did not live many years past the war himself. But the hardest thing ever said about that afternoon was never said by any of them. It was said by the other side, against a wall, with a firing squad, in the days after a bridge on the last river refused to fall.